Hello, everyone. I wanted to do an update on the Napoleon difficulty and give a video on the inspiration for the name and why it fits the difficulty setting. Part of the reason I'm doing this is I had no idea anyone would ever take this seriously because the whole point, as I'll get into, of Napoleon difficulty is you're not supposed to succeed under these like very strict rule sets. Um, the name is not for all of the brilliant victories that Napoleon earned in his, illustrious career at Austerlitz and Genta and many other of his victories. That's not the point of the name. We're actually going to the end of his career. So after his spectacular failure in Russia, we are trying to mimic what it must have felt like trying to do battle. So for those of you that don't know, I happen to like Napoleon, uh, this warts and all. Like I'm well aware of his human rights violations, but I'm also well aware of his civil reforms and the impact that had on Europe, which is still felt today. And I also like to point out that I think Napoleon's strategic ability is still an extremely important part of war. I wouldn't be surprised if West Point made it a special focus to study Napoleon's, order of battle and the way he thought about things. There's this book I have called The Campaigns of Napoleon. I highly recommend if you're really into the details of war and you like watching Tick's videos, you should read this giant mammoth of a book. It's called The Campaigns of Napoleon by David Chandler. I feel like you will know if you can read this book and just kind of appreciate what Napoleon was doing, you understand what's happening in World War II. Like you can see that the Germans were very clearly trying to follow Napoleon level strategy, sometimes with great success and other times not so much. And keep in mind, they had horse-drawn artillery in the no, Napoleonic times, and for most of the war, Germans were using towed artillery with horses. Uh, so you're gonna get like a sense of the flavor and the idea of attacking the critical point, uh, which is something Deductor talks about a lot, is emphasized in this book. I feel like you're going to learn a lot about war and you're going to understand why certain battles develop the way they did. What I wanted to focus on was how Napoleon, the feeling of what Napoleon was going through after the failure of the Russian campaign. So the prestige drop. So you're losing 75% prestige. This is like the reality for Napoleon is his how he was viewed by his peers and by his allies after the failure of the Russian campaign was very serious and substantial. A lot of his allies turned on him. I think it was like the Seventh Great Alliance. There was a lot of great alliances against Napoleon, but I think the final one, they came together. Some of his allies actually joined with the British, and then the Austrians didn't like him very much. Uh, and he lost prestige. Like he lost, 500 something thousand men in this really stupid battle. He had actually been losing prestige before that due to the Peninsula campaign in Spain and Portugal. He only participated a little bit in, but he definitely is the instigator for why hundreds of thousands of French lives were lost in another useless campaign. So the double Rommel effect is to capture this feeling like Napoleon did not have the ability to just buy infantry. For most of his campaigns, he did conscription, and earlier in the war it was a little bit easier because he had a very high esteem among the populace, and he was very charismatic. But after the Russian campaign, people started making fun of him, and so on and so on. So we're going to mimic that. And then the AI getting 200 prestige is kind of just like, we're mimicking the fact that all of Napoleon's enemies were suddenly flush with resources. Let us not forget that the British were funding Napoleon's enemies. They had plenty of money. They had control over many of the most lucrative trade routes. They had the strongest navy in the world. Funding some enemy of Napoleon was a trivial exercise for the British Empire. And also, they made a lot of money off of his failed continental system due to the black market. Ironically, Napoleon's continental system was enriching the very people he hated the most, um, which tends to happen with dictators and when they get these ideas in their head about how things are supposed to work. So yeah, we're going to give the enemy, extra prestige. The double field marshal effect. So, before he even started the Russian campaign, Napoleon was suffering from experienced troop loss. Some of this was heavily driven, maybe most of this, by the Spanish campaign. He lost a lot of great generals in that, and obviously a lot of highly experienced men. And then whatever experienced men he had when he entered Russia, almost all of those were dead. I mean, in terms of like, field marshals that served him, I think he only had like a couple that were highly competent and highly experienced. So it makes perfect sense to kind of mimic that. Like you're constantly behind on experience. So this was an issue Napoleon ran into when he was retreating and trying to defend what was left of his territory. How do you train these new conscripts who are not particularly motivated to fight for him, and you've lost some of your best officers? So we're going to capture that feeling right away. Like we're always going to feel like we don't have enough experience, and that's the point. And I'm going to give the AI a bonus experience because by the point Napoleon was retreating from Russia, his enemies had learned from all of those failed battles before how to do combat better. But despite all that, the hilarious thing about this is Napoleon defended France in 1813 really well. Like it's unclear if his marshals hadn't decided to throw in the towel. You know, Napoleon had, surprisingly, he had a lot of fight left in him, and he was actually doing some brilliant stuff defending France. Sometimes he hesitated here and there and lost some key bridges, but despite the lack of resources, despite the lack of experienced troops, despite the loss of prestige on the world stage, despite the fact that his allies had betrayed him, somehow Napoleon was able to exploit overextended drives, and he did win quite a few battles. I mean, he won quite a few battles consecutively against all odds. He was able to march his troops from one field to the other. And there are some historians that kind of wonder, like, if his field marshals in Paris had stuck with him and they decided not to surrender, because he did lose Paris in the middle of all this, but it's kind of like when you take the city, but the army is still floating out there. Have you really won? Something the Germans kind of learned. And Napoleon clearly wanted to keep fighting, but once his field marshals were like, "Hey, we're done," then he had to surrender. So, despite all of these obstacles, you can still do some brilliant things, and hopefully, we can capture that. Uh, what else? SE infantry units. Yeah, so I'm just the big reason I want this to be required is so people cannot exploit SE tanks to protect against soft cap, and you get SE tanks get bonuses in his mod. Uh, so you get like extra fuel, ammo, and +1 heart attack. None of that is trivial. So also this is forcing you to play with units that a lot of people neglect. I think the best playthrough of Panzer Corps is the Doctor's mod. I love listening to it. But he ends up getting like 3 or 4 like SE infantry, and I love his commentary, and I think he really had spectacular tactics. I almost wish that he would finish that campaign because he was really starting to tear it up with like even more brilliant tactics. It was almost like he was warming up. Um, Something I realized, by the way, that kind of makes me wonder if this is possible, this whole thing, is I didn't realize in 43 he switched from double Rommel to Rommel. So if you're ever watching it and you're like, well, he's taking all this damage, how is he elite reinforcing things, and he was reinforcing things during the scenario. Well, that's because he was flush with prestige because he was no longer on double rung. So I don't even know if you could continue this once you hit 43. I mean, he was really hurting by the end of 42, and that might have been why he was probably thinking, if I don't get myself more prestige, I'm just going to get run over. Kind of like the Germans at a certain point, right after Kursk, is when the pain started, and they were just unable. If you read like synopses on all these battles after Kursk, the Germans were just unable to hold back the Soviet hordes. There's just their best units got wasted at Kursk, uh, and your SE divisions could only do so much. Okay, so yeah, so I'm just forcing you to play with different types of SE units. Okay, the other thing that's going to make this playthrough much, 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 much harder is that you can't use your hero units. Um, so all those clever tricks and tactics that me and others have come up with these hero units, you don't have that anymore. And it turns out, not having those units, the game is very hard, in my opinion. Very hard. I would say the difficulty triples because you can use them to like block attacks and stop a whole like an entire division from attacking you. Without this, the whole game changes. It's actually brutal. You have to be more cautious. You can't do these reckless heroic things anymore. And I require deductors mod, or you can use Lucarnis, which I'm testing out. And the reason for that is the stat upgrades on enemy units are more historically realistic. If you just saw my Spoils of War playthrough where I took a big L, like a big L, uh, you can see like attacking the planes. Like I don't even attack the Soviet fighters with my fighter. Not it's like I'm supposed to win, but sometimes it goes very, very poorly. It goes so poorly that you risk losing your fighter. It's pretty ridiculous. And like a plane like I forgot what it's not the Stormovik. I forgot what that bomber is called, but even against flak, honestly, those things have very high air defense, or I should say ground defense. And it's so difficult to damage them. If you watch Deductor play in 43 or even 42 for that matter, it is a massive struggle in the air war, and he brought 5 fighters. Okay, I mean, I would argue that that was a mistake because the fighters can only attack once. He even like at one point in a scenario, he was kind of like, "Oh, I should probably have some like AA on the ground," and he's just not used to doing that. And it was probably the biggest strategic mistake he made was he needed more AA. He would only bring 2 88 guns, and it's just not enough. So you can kind of see that I if you watch that, I'm like shying away from attacking the Soviet planes. They're non-trivial. And the idea was, which I couldn't execute on because of weather, was to use my ground AA to attack their planes. And it's much more effective. It's much safer. Weaken the fighters enough so that your fighter can go in, and it's like a reduced risk. This is why you want this mod, because you're going to find you can't clear up the air that easily. You may find that there's planes at the end of the scenario that you haven't killed. Probably more historically accurate. The other thing is, this is something you have to do. You can use the airfields for troop transports. You just have to, it's very simple. You can go into the editor and add that in the transports settings. And this is cool because you can transport troops around that don't have trucks. So we don't have transportation for most of our infantry. So that basically leaves you with boats, trains, and planes. And a lot of infantry divisions were transported by train. That's historically accurate. Now, I think the most advanced Panzer divisions did have motorized transport, but what I kind of notice when I was watching Deductor play is he can exploit motorized transport to get like huge edges. Uh, so I'm kind of like taking that away. I'm going to make the player really have to logistically plan how do you get the troops to the front line. This was an issue that the Germans had the entire war, basically. How do you get these troops? Because we have a lack of trucks. How do we get them there? It's non-trivial. Like Dunkirk was a problem because the armor was way ahead of the infantry. Now, if they had motorized transport, maybe that wouldn't have been a problem. Okay. And exit hexes. This is exciting. This is very easy to add as well to any map. What this allows you to do is exit a unit and then pull in from your reserve a new unit. You see me use it over and over again as well as war. Not very effective because I couldn't advance because I didn't have spotting on the enemy. But later, exit hexes are probably much more valuable 1940 and on, uh, because you might have like a really damaged tank and it's dangerous to keep it out there, so you need to get like a new frontline unit. Uh, and I remember I was watching Night Phoenix talk about, well, I can't play for 6 hours. The live play doesn't mean that you're playing for 6 hours. It just means you're showing your real time decisions. And if you have to break that into many parts, that's fine. I mean, Deductor had to do this. I don't remember if Deductor had to do it because he got tired or because his CPU couldn't handle the memory of the recording because he was constantly having crashes. Um, yeah, so the other thing is you may not use truck transports, but everything else is allowed. And that's cool. There's all kinds of cool, nifty things that you can do. This is a big one, and this is really actually, you know what? I don't want this in the hardcore, frankly. I don't know how I feel about it. Let me just put it that way. I think this is a hardcore. I'll talk about that later. Okay. Must accept first heroes. This is gonna frustrate everybody. If you watch my spoilers of war, the first hero I got on my Stuka was spotting +1. The good news about that is I can upgrade the Stuka to something where a spotting hero is actually useful. So it's not all bad news. Um, yeah, so this is like a lot of people get a bad hero, like a spotting hero on an artillery, and they get frustrated about it, and then they sell it and get a new artillery. Well, you can't do that. You gotta roll with it. You have to figure out ways to use your heroes. This is going to increase your creativity. Only use German units. I'm also saying you can't use the Polish artillery. Just to be fair, you can sell it, of course. So the reason to only use German units is to kind of mimic what Napoleon was experiencing as he lost the Russian conflict. I think he only kept a few Prussian allies as he was defending Prussia. I think almost all of his allies didn't send him any troops, including I think his brother of like Sweden, or a cousin or something, like who was formerly in an alliance with Napoleon but didn't actually send him any troops. I think he actually sent troops to the other side. So the Germans are on their own, right? We can't use like T-34s and KVs and all that nice artillery or Sherman tanks. So Deductor was using that in his playthrough, and I think it was like a cheat code for how he got around the low prestige to buy core unit slots. Well, I'm going to make it extra hard for you and say you can't do that. You can sell your capturable units. That's not the problem. You're going to want to do it anyway because you don't have any prestige. Okay. Uh, yeah, you have to keep the transports of your SE units, but those transports need to be different. What I'm envisioning here is that the Mountaineers are probably going to have no truck, so you can preserve their movement bonuses, and then a regular will have a truck, and then you'll have a Grenadier that has a half track, which become available in Norway. So this is all very reasonable. You have to accept turn one weather, uh, and like mentally prepare yourself for failure because like you can go for decisive victory, but just be aware the risk of losing a unit is extremely high on certain battles. So I didn't push in spoils of war because I have no prestige. I can't afford to lose a unit. I almost lost a unit anyway. I actually almost lost 2 units, despite me trying to be careful, but I didn't do a very good job. Like I had to keep. It's okay because you have to think long term. You know, I lose a couple hundred prestige because I didn't get the decisive victory, but I'm keeping my units alive because I can't afford to buy the same unit again. Now, uh, this is a lot. Like this is probably I don't even know if this is possible. This right here, all these restrictions. I don't know if this is possible. But the reason I have the hardcore setting here is I want to protect the player from themselves. So the biggest reward when you're playing a Deductor's mod is not the prestige. That's just a handicap. The biggest reward is every star. Like there's a big difference in battle outcomes as you gain experience. If you try to get super cheap and you don't elite replace your units after battle, you may find that they are not at the critical 3-star point when you need them to be. So the whole point is to force the player to invest in the core. It also prevents you from cheaply over strengthening, units that don't get damaged, which increases suppression and kills. Like if I force you to spend prestige on this, you're actually facing some pretty serious trade-offs. Like maybe you can't buy your wonder unit. Maybe you can't deploy this unit because you can't afford the replacement costs. I don't know how realistic this is. Like this, some of these battles in 1940 are extremely nasty. So you could be looking at, I don't know, 700 or 800 prestige and elite replacement costs. I mean, it might force you to be much more cautious. That's for sure. Also, no lost units can be restored, uh, and no more than half artillery can be mechanized. That's just to kind of keep things somewhat balanced in case you try to get nothing but mechanized artillery. Uh, and then no overstrength allowed on your regular core units. So that's right, no overstrength on anything that's not SE. Um, and this is to I'm primarily thinking of artillery. Uh, like I this rule might need to be changed. Mostly because you might want to overstrengthen certain types of things like level bombers, but I think it almost doesn't matter because the prestige situation will always be catastrophic. So I think it would be very, very difficult for anyone to justify overstrengthening for a long time because you need to buy core unit slots. But I will allow SE units to be overstrengthened. That's fine. That's historical reality. They get everything nice, and that's how it is. The other reason I wanted to show off the Deductor's mod again is just try to show off as many unit types as possible. And I actually think it's pretty viable to do this, but it'll be very expensive. So if you want those wonder units, be prepared to pay for it. And this is just a list here. I think I have a link to this document that you can browse. This is what I think the core would look like. Um, Something like this. So, uh, so the inspiration is we're trying to mimic Napoleon defending France after the failure of the Russian campaign. So we should always feel desperate. We should always feel on the edge of our seat. We should always feel like disaster could strike at any moment. And I think this difficulty combined with the Ductor's mod is like perfect for capturing that sense of desperation that Napoleon was feeling as he defended France. That was the point of this. And I think this is harder than ultimate mode. Well, if you live played ultimate mode, I don't know if there's anything harder than that. There's a reason nobody live plays ultimate mode. Well, I've done a few live plays of ultimate mode, but the amount of effort that is put into that is so insane that no reasonable person would ever do it. And it's only for crazy people to even try. Um, so yeah, I kind of you should always be stressed. You should always feel like you can't relax. You should always feel that you can't be reckless. Um, so this is the update. Let me know what you think of these rules and if you think that there should be tweaks or something that I'm missing here. But this is quite a few restrictions. But the funny thing is, there's a lot of freedom and creativity as well, especially if you add the exit hexes. It can kind of change the dynamic and flow of battle. Um, and also, you're going to be playing with a lot of different units. I showed Wizgorod with my bridge engineer. I got multiple pockets of surrenders because I had a bridge engineer. Nobody has ever shown a map like that before. Nobody's ever shown that tactic on that map before. Don't underestimate all these alternative units. You just have to like sit there and think more like Napoleon. Napoleon definitely knew the value of bridge engineers. He didn't always execute on that very well, but he understood the importance of having the ability to make a bridge and have your units cross quickly. So already if you're using bridge engineers to force surrenders or to attack from an unexpected direction, that is a Napoleon level idea, strategic idea. So that's what I have to say.